Hey crew, before we get started today, I wanted to let you know that our live episode recorded in front of a studio audience is currently available on our Facebook page at facebook.com/EISTpod. That is the rough video version of our panel on Star Trek 2009 from Convergence Con 2019 in the Twin Cities, which we did 2 weekends ago. It was a very fun time. It was, like or hate JJ Trek, there's something for you in that show. A polished and edited version of that panel will soon be available in audio form, joining the other live shows we've done from Convergence and other cons on our Patreon at patreon.com/EISTpod. If you like what you hear on that show, please consider becoming a crew member of our show and enjoying the services and privileges you would be thereby entitled to. We just got back from Shore Leave Con, and wow, thereby hangs a tale, or 12. A lot to report from Shore Leave, which we'll do in full on next week's supplemental episode. But suffice it here to say that we had an amazing time. Thanks to the con organizers who really know what they're doing. We met a lot of incredible people, many of whom have been guests on this show. And joining their ranks today is Jim Johnson. I was glad to get a chance to meet Jim face to face. Jim is the line editor for the Star Trek Adventures RPG from Modifius, and he hosted a pair of panels about the line and what they've got going on. And I got the itch now. Where's my dice? I'm thinking it's time to roll up a Starfleet officer. The thing is, I don't think anybody in my immediate role-playing circle plays Star Trek RPG, so either I'm going to have to be a real evangelist for the game and probably run it myself, or try to get some kind of internet game going. I don't know. What do you think? Is Discord an option? Is Roll20 an option? Would you be interested in an internet game of Star Trek Adventures? Let's crowdsource this. Let me know what you think on Twitter at EISTpod or on our Enterprising Interlocutions Facebook group, or email the show at EISTpod@gmail.com. Fetch my dice. Let's roll. Hope you enjoy my talk with Jim. See you next week for a roundup of our Shore Leave experience. And with that, let's get underway.
It's worked so far, but we're not out yet.
I wanna know what you're thinking. There are some things you can't hide. I wanna know what you're feeling. Tell me what's on your mind.
Pure energy.
Hailing frequencies open, and welcome to Enterprising Individuals, the Star Trek discussion podcast that boldly goes into excruciating detail about the series, characters, and stories of the Star Trek universe. I'm your host, Aaron Coker, aka Caliban, and I became caught in a temporal inversion, reappearing only sporadically to my son over the course of a century, until he finally died in my arms, and I was snapped back to the moment of my supposed death, and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. I'm joined on this episode by Jim Johnson. Jim is a writer and freelancer who has written several short stories set in the Star Trek universe. He's also the author of the Pistols and Pyramid series, as well as the Potomac Shadows series, and he's written for role-playing games set in the Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, and White Wolf universes. Jim, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me aboard.
Permission to come aboard granted. Today we'll be talking about The Visitor, the second episode of the fourth season of Star Trek Deep Space Nine. Any writer will tell you it's hard to write about writing. Except for Stephen King. That guy can turn out 100,000 words on anything. But most fiction about the production of fiction falls short, at least in this humble writer's opinion. The split second of inspiration, the countless hours of perspiration, the insecurity, the rejection, the flashes of megalomania, the leg cramps, all these aspects seem like good elements for drama, but they tend to be less than photogenic when put on the screen. There's a reason Satan shows up in the third act of Barton Fink, after all. Spoilers for Barton Fink, by the way. The writers of Deep Space Nine, however, were game for a range of challenging and unorthodox story subjects. More than anything, they wanted to present stories and characters that had never before been seen in the Trek universe. And one of those characters was Jake Sisko. Jake was a character unlike any Trek had showcased previously. He was the son of a widower, he was a black teen in space, and he had no desire to follow in the military footsteps of his father. Instead, Jake wanted to be a writer, an artist, a profession that had never been explored on Trek before, despite the Federation's commitment to the humanities and self-exploration. But as an artist and as one of the truly civilian characters on DS9, the character of Jake served as one of our best windows into the humanity of the 24th century Federation citizen. But we'll talk about that a little later in the show. I always ask new guests to the show about their backstory. How did you discover Star Trek and become a Star Trek fan?
Oh my gosh, Star Trek has been a lifelong love of mine. I think I started watching it back in the 70s. I had a little tiny 4-inch black and white portable TV that I had to put tinfoil on the aerial in order to get any sort of reception.
Yes.
And I managed to watch a couple of reruns on that, and then graduated to slightly larger televisions over the years, and just kept watching reruns of the original series, and it grew from there.
It's funny how screens started off so small, and we wanted them to be big, and now we want screens to be small so they can be in our pockets.
Yeah.
Is DS9 your favorite series?
By far, yeah. So I watched Next Generation. That was my college years, and I loved Next Gen because I thought it really spoke to me in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But once DS9 came out and I saw Emissary, that was just a whole new world of possibilities opened up, and part of that was also that was college days, and just getting to understand more about the world and diversity and inclusion and different world views and that kind of stuff. DS9 really opened up a lot of questions and addressed different things that we hadn't seen in Star Trek yet, really. And that series, more than any of the other ones, really spoke to me.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. And I'm sure you've seen the documentary recently, What We Left Behind.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I love the fact that they point out how important that was to them and how they were exploring issues like that. And I think that's a great aspect of the series. You describe yourself as an Egyptophile. How would you describe an Egyptophile? What form does that take?
So totally amateur Egyptologist. So
okay.
Way back in the day, I used to, when I was working in college, I worked at a bookstore, Walden Books, way back.
Oh,
that's
yeah, sure.
Way back when, before they got bought by Borders. But so Walden Books, I was assistant manager there, and I just spend my lunch hours in the day stocking books and going through the history section, and just got really interested in ancient Egypt's history, and just went on from there. And at the time, we didn't have the internet, but we had microfiche, and I could order a bunch of really old, esoteric, weird texts about ancient Egypt history.
Sure.
And so I'd special order those and get them. And I've got a eclectic library of really like a mix of commercially available and really deep scholarly texts about ancient Egypt. And it's always been a fascination of mine, which is funny because I hate the heat. I hate the humidity
Sure.
and the dry heat. So I don't know if I'll ever actually make it to Egypt, but I love the culture, and I'm fascinated by the history and just everything about it. And what really, really sparks my imagination is that ancient Egypt's culture was so old, like we're talking thousands and thousands of years, that they had archaeologists working on ancient Egypt history. It just boggles my mind. Like, 2,000 years into it, they had people that were studying their own history from 1,000 years back. And it's just hard to imagine the scope of a culture that lived on in some capacity for, several thousand years.
Yeah. I have to ask, and I think I know the answer. Have you played Assassin's Creed Origins?
I did. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, that's I haven't played an Assassin's Creed game in a while, but I had to check that one out. And something that it really drove home for me was that point, because the game is set during the Ptolemaic era, around the time that Rome is sort of getting involved. But you look back and there's already ruins. Like, things are already ruined. Their culture's been around for 2,500 years. It's mind-boggling to think how old it is.
Yeah. I mean, and for us here in the States, we've only been around for 200 and something years.
Yeah.
We think that's a long time, but then you think about these cultures that have been around for thousands and thousands of years, and it kind of puts things in perspective.
Yeah, it's incredible. And that love helped you create your fiction series, Pistols and Pyramids, which is described as ancient Egyptian spaghetti western with magic, and of course with mummies as well. What was the inspiration behind that, besides your love of Egypt?
So, I mean, I already had the love of Egypt in hand, and I'm a big fan of Westerns too. Western, spaghetti Westerns, Western TV series, all that stuff I grew up with. And, that's a tie to Star Trek too, because Star Trek was supposed to be wagon train, in space. Sure. But so just, doing a mind mapping activity as a writer, I was thinking about all the different interests I have, listing it out on index cards, just all the different interests I have. And then, to be creative, you try to take those different interests and figure out ways to combine them. And I think one day I just pulled up ancient Egypt and Western. I was like, hey, how do I make ancient Egypt and Western work together in some sort of a storyline? And threw it together and came up with the Pistols and Pyramids series. Yeah. And it was a lot of fun to write, although I think it was kind of a hard grasp for a lot of readers to really dig into because it might have been a little too much of a secondary world and too much of a reach to have ancient Egypt, ideas and religion and faith and magic and stuff in a weird Western setting. So I may revisit it again someday, but I sure had fun working on it.
Sure. And you would describe it as Weird West then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I love Westerns too, and I also really like Weird West fiction as well, because many Westerns are, they're about frontier fiction and they're about defending your values, against the unknown. But I like Weird West because it sort of digs into that weirder side. And it's really weird when you think about it. Somebody who lives in a city and then gets on a horse and goes out in the middle of nowhere, and there's strange creatures and there's harsh environments. And I think that suits itself so well to Lovecraftian horrors or strange animal spirits or something like that. I'm surprised that there aren't more Weird West tales.
Yeah, I am too. Because I love reading Weird West, and I just don't see enough of it on the shelves. And the advice is if you don't see the book that you want to read, then you have to write it yourself.
Write it, right?
So I took that philosophy to heart.
Well, you're a writer and a line editor on Star Trek Adventures as well, the Star Trek role-playing game from Modiphius. How did you get involved with that?
This goes back quite a ways. So in the early 2000s, I was a freelance writer and playtest coordinator for the Lord of the Rings role-playing game that Decipher was doing at the time. Sure. And Decipher also had the license to Star Trek at the time. And one of the fellow writers and playtest coordinators I worked with was a guy named Jason Dural. And Jason is the line manager for the Conan game that Modiphius does right now. And a few years back, he and I kept touch over the years. And a couple of years ago, he reached out to me and said, hey, Modiphius just picked up a really great license, and I can't tell you what it is, but you should send your CV to Modiphius because I think you'll be interested. And so I was curious, and I trust him, so I did it. And they said, well, we got the Star Trek license. Do you want to work on it? And I was like, yes, of course. And just went on from there. And just in the years of being a writer and connecting with other writers, I had a lot of friends that are in the business to one degree or another, and I was able to bring some additional contacts with me to Modiphius that really helped us establish the line and give us give CBS a lot of confidence in what we're doing. Yeah, and we've just rolled on from there.
Well, that's great. Your friend couldn't have said they're going to boldly go, but I can't tell you what it is though. But you should definitely check it out.
I think the first message he sent to me, he may have signed off with "Live Long and Prosper."
Okay, all right, there you go. Yeah, that's what you need.
I don't remember. I'd have to pull it up, but there was some sort of code in the email that made it clear to me what he was talking about, even though he couldn't directly tell me because I hadn't signed an NDA yet.
Right. I used to play the Last Unicorn games back in the day, and had a lot of fun with those, mostly because I came mostly from a 20-sided D&D combat-based thing, and my friends and I really enjoyed the sort of skill-based storytelling aspects of the Last Unicorn games.
Yeah, my group we started off with the FASA version, and we liked the concept, but we did a lot of house brewing, house rules to it. And played that way for a while. And then when the Last Unicorns version came out, we played that a lot and really loved it. And then, of course, Last Unicorn got bought by Wizards of the Coast. We tried out Wizards of the Coast. Well, actually, Wizards of the Coast didn't do anything with it, but the team went on to Decipher and did the Decipher version of the game, which I thought was good, but it felt a little too close to D20 for my tastes. And then once Decipher collapsed, the Star Trek license for RPGs just sat there for 14, 15 years, and nobody picked it up as far as I can remember. Yeah. And then finally Modiphius came along and picked it up. But it's just nice to see it's getting some love now, and it's been a long time since we've had a Star Trek license on the RPG side.
For sure. What sets the Modiphius system apart from the FASA or the earlier games?
Well, I mean, to be silly, we don't have that many skills. Okay. Like if you remember Last Unicorn and FASA, and to some extent Decipher, they had a very long skill list. Yes. And a lot of specializations within those skills. We've narrowed it down to just 6 disciplines that match the departments of the show. So you got
Sure.
command, medicine, sciences, engineering, medical. And I think that simplifies it in a lot of ways because it's not quite so you don't have such a huge complex list of stuff to look at on a character sheet.
Yeah.
But we really focus the storytelling aspect and on a character's values and what is it, what makes that character tick? Why is this character different from another character?
Yeah.
And why are they in Starfleet? What is their perspective on life? We really try to get into the social conflict and the social interactions, and of course, combat's a piece of it. But we really focus more on the the social aspect and the drama that's inherent in the TV show.
That's really great, and I think that's really important to Star Trek storytelling. I remember that the Last Unicorn system had a function where you could take disadvantages to gain extra character creation points. And of course, if you're not careful, your players will go nuts abusing that. So we all ended up with like these emotionally broken supermen who could do anything but would be really distraught about it. Yeah. Well, can you talk about you mentioned your short story work before. How did you end up submitting to Strange New Worlds?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, gosh, in the 90s, I was just out of college and I was heavily involved in community theater because I needed something to do with my free time because all of a sudden I was graduated from college. I was working full time, but I was like, I've got all this free time now. What do I do with it?
Yeah.
And so I joined a local theater group, and one of my friends in that theater group was also an up and coming writer, and he submitted some short stories to the Strange New Worlds contest that Simon and Schuster ran at the time. They ran it for a total of 10 years, but at the time they were running it, and basically it followed the tradition of the TV shows where they would open up to spec scripts from fans, from anybody who could write a spec script. You could send it into Paramount and they would look at it, and most of the time they would just reject you outright. But sometimes if they thought there was something promising, they would invite you in for pitch sessions.
Sure.
But so anyway, so my friend Kevin Summers, he wrote a short story called Isolation Ward 4, and it got published in one of the Star Trek anthologies. And I was like, well, gosh, if you can do it, why not take a shot at it? So I started writing short stories and fired them off to the contest. And just over the course of several years, I managed to get 3 of them published, which was incredibly gratifying to be able to contribute a little tiny piece to the big, huge Star Trek tapestry.
Yeah.
And that led to I was able to get some contacts with Simon & Schuster and worked with a couple of the editors there and got invited to write another short story for one of the anthologies, one of the Mirror Universe anthologies. And right about the same time, they were starting to cut back on their novel line. So instead of doing 2 mass market releases every month, they dropped it to 1 release a month. And by doing that, they had to really change how they were approaching what writers they were going to get for those books. So there was a period of time where they were willing to try out newer writers on novels because they were doing so many novels in a given year.
Right.
But right about the time I was pitching novel ideas to them, they had to cut back. And so I didn't get an opportunity to write a novel, which is too bad. But I found other ways to scratch the Star Trek itch, as it were.
Absolutely. Well, why did you choose this specific episode, The Visitor, to discuss today?
So Visitor, when I watched DS9 on first run, back in the 90s now, it was a really great episode that really resonated with me at the time just because it was so different from what Star Trek had generally done in the past, where you didn't see a lot of episodes really focused on family relationships, father-son, mother-daughter, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the acting and the music and the direction, everything was just so good in this episode. It all came together really nicely. And it really, pulls on the heartstrings. I was when I saw it the first time around, I was in tears watching it because it was just so well done.
Yeah.
I thought Tony Todd did just a brilliant job of acting an elder Jake Sisko.
Yeah.
So that is, all of that is just enough of a reason to watch it. But now, I have a 3-year-old, and I've only just recently watched this episode again, and I hadn't watched it since before he was born, and then he got born, and now there's a whole nother layer to the story that really impacted me differently, because now that I'm a father and I have a son, and there's that whole additional layer of relationship that I am now aware of. So it hit me, and I was in tears again watching it, but it just hit me in just a whole different way, because now there's that whole other piece to it to think about.
Yeah. I talk to a lot of writers on this show, and I'm an aspiring writer myself. And of course, all this fiction that we love consuming is created by writers. So I'm fascinated by the decision to make the character of Jake Sisko a writer. And I know that the show isn't, Deep Space Nine Author's Corner, but I always kind of regret that they didn't get a chance to do more with the character and his ambitions in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah, and I thought it was funny too with Visitor. They used a aspiring writer as kind of the character to help Jake kind of get some of the dialogue going back and forth to explain things. Yeah. I just thought it was great because having been a writer for a while now, I've spent my time on plenty of discussion forums of writers and prospective writers, and like everything she's saying is exactly what new prospective writers say.
Sure. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I haven't actually written anything yet, but I've done a lot of reading and I'm thinking about what I want to say and all this and this. And I'm like, yeah. And of course, when I was first starting out writing, I was saying the same thing too. But it's just funny how clearly the episode was written by a writer who knows writers, and knows what we say and knows how we think, and it's like, you totally identified with it.
Yeah. As far as Jake goes, it's sort of like the situation with Wesley on TNG, I think. Not just because they're teenage boys, but the conversation surrounding Wesley is always that he's going to be a great man someday. He's going to be a great Starfleet officer. I can't wait to see the man he becomes. And I feel like Jake's writing, unfortunately, and it's because of the Dominion War storyline, but it gets relegated to that same trope. Like, we keep getting told that he'll be great, but, we never really see him get there.
Yeah, they talk about it a little bit here and there when they talk about how his novel Anselm does well, and then he wrote that set of collected stories that wins some sort of award. And there was a couple episodes that focused on him as a writer, but I mean, obviously, yes, they could have certainly done a lot more. But when you have a cast of 9 and then a deep pool of recurring characters that you have to service as well, it's hard to balance everything.
Yeah.
So I would have loved to have seen more with Jake. I'm happy with what they did with him, but certainly could have done more.
Yeah.
But I did appreciate that they turned him into a reporter though during the war.
Young boy becomes a writer, or gigantic intergalactic war between the Dominion and the Federation. I know what the audience would want there. Well, we are talking about the DS9 episode, The Visitor. It is the second episode of the 4th season. It first aired on October 9th of 1995, and it was written by Michael Taylor, who was a writer on 4 episodes of DS9 in total. He also wrote the teleplay for In the Pale Moonlight, and he got his start as a freelancer for the show. After DS9, he became a staff writer on Star Trek Voyager, and he wrote and contributed to 20 different episodes for that show. He was also a writer and co-executive producer on the Battlestar Galactica reboot, Caprica, Defiance, Turn, and Into the Badlands. And also I should mention that writer-producer Renee Echevarria also did an uncredited rewrite on this episode.
Nice.
Episode was directed by David Livingston, who, as you can imagine, I've talked about so much, I've run out of things to say about him. But I'll remind listeners that he is still, at 62 episodes, the most prolific director in the Star Trek franchise. There's no star date given for this episode, but it takes place at various points 2372, 2373, 2389, 2408, 2422, and ends in the future at 2450. And your assignment, Jim, if you can, is to give us a 25-word synopsis of The Visitor.
Ben Sisko and Jake are on the Defiant on a, if I remember right, unspecified mission. There is a crisis in the engineering room. Ben and Jake go to try to fix it. They fix it, but a subspace anomaly creates a subspace tether between the two of them. Sisko is thrown into a subspace pocket. I've lost count of how many words I'm at. Jake lives his life with Ben suspended in subspace. Ben is able to, the subspace tether occasionally brings Ben into Jake's timeline. So where years pass for Jake, only a few moments pass for Ben. Ben gets to see his son grow up, grow old. And Jake discovers this, and because Jake cannot let go because he loves his dad so much, he changes his career path from writer to astrophysicist. He figures out a way to get his father back, but in so doing has to make a critical decision that I don't want to spoil if you haven't seen it yet in the 20-some years.
Oh, yeah. And hopefully, maybe we'll give a spoiler tag later on if people don't want to get spoiled about that. That was great. That was very complete. It's always a vain task to ask a writer to summarize because they want to give the whole set of beats and everything, and I understand that.
Right. Yeah.
Here's some interesting facts from our memory banks about this episode. Apparently, Michael Taylor had based the idea of the episode, and I hadn't heard this story, on the story of a fan visiting a writer, in this case, the real story of a young journalist who scored an interview with the famously reclusive J.D. Salinger. Apparently she just wrote him and showed up on his doorstep, and he's like, yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. Before Michael Taylor became a full-time writer on Trek and a writing partner of Ronald D. Moore, fans assumed that his name was a pseudonym for the combination of Michael Piller and Jerry Taylor, because the script was so good and so emotional. And of course, Michael Taylor was an unknown freelancer at this time, so people assumed that it was either a joke or it signified a collaboration between producer-writers Taylor and Piller. I had mentioned earlier that Rene Echeverria rewrote the episode, and after doing so, he expressed disappointment that Chief O'Brien had to be cut from the episode due to shooting conflicts in Colombini's schedule. And in fact, the next episode in Season 4, Hippocratic Oath, was actually shot before this episode to accommodate that schedule. I didn't know what to think when I heard this, but apparently concept artist John Eaves, who's worked on DS9, Enterprise, Discovery, and many of the Star Trek films, based the design for Jake's house on the Haunted Mansion in Disneyland. Have you ever been to the Haunted Mansion in Disneyland?
A number of times, yeah, and I wouldn't have made that connection.
Yeah, I thought it was weird.
But, I have a copy of the, and I'm sure you do too, the DS9 Companion, which is a wealth of information. And there's actually a picture of of Jake's house in there. Okay. And I don't think it's in the text. It didn't occur to me to even think that that's based on the Haunted Mansion. So, hey, great factoid. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, sure. The characters of old Jake and Melanie are seen again in the Prophecy and Change anthology from Pocket Books. The frame story of the collection sees Melanie visit Jake in the real timeline of the show, once he is an elderly, accomplished writer, and he tells her stories of his youth that make up the stories in the anthology. And Jake will eventually start to write Anselm in the main timeline episode, in the episode The Muse.
The Muse. Is that the one where Jake gets involved with someone and she's got like
she massages his head and suddenly he can write? Yeah.
Don't remember loving it, but it's DS9, so I can't hate it.
It's an interesting one. The Star Trek Vanguard series of novels also features a 23rd century journalist named Tim Pennington, after whom the Pennington School is presumably named. And there is a real boarding school in New Jersey called the Pennington School. The American writer and journalist Stephen Crane attended the Pennington School. Crane will be obliquely referenced again in the Season 5 episode Nor the Battle to the Strong, as that episode heavily references Crane's seminal work, The Red Badge of Courage. All the future Starfleet uniforms and comm badges in this episode are the same as are seen in the future segments of All Good Things, and I believe in Endgame as well. And as we are getting ready for the debut of Picard here, I was wondering if they would try to stick to that sort of design aesthetic. We see in All Good Things these kind of monochrome future Starfleet uniforms with this new insignia. And I know that it's a financial thing, but, whenever we see future flashes in DS9, they're wearing them. They use them in Voyager as well. So, like I said, I know it's economic, but it seems like a real commitment to a unified design going forward.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how closely they do that. I know that I didn't look at it too closely. I know somebody online has done an extensive analysis like one or two still shots from Picard, analyzing the uniforms. And like, on the one hand, it's great that they're doing it, but we only have like one or two still shots to work from.
It's not much
to get too excited, but we fans, we can't help it. So we got to analyze.
We have to dig in.
I would think that CBS has the budget to do all new uniforms if they wanted to, but it would be a nice callback if they did do something that was reminiscent of the future style uniforms that we've seen already.
I agree. Let's talk about our guest stars for this episode. There's a couple. Tony Todd plays the adult Jake in this episode. Todd has had a long and successful career in film and television. He, of course, played the titular character in the film Candyman and its two sequels, and he's appeared in other films such as Platoon, Lean on Me, The Crow, The Rock, and he has a recurring role as CI director Graham on the NBC series Chuck. He's also the voice of Professor Zoom on the CW's The Flash, and he's also played Kern, of course, the brother of Worf on TNG and DS9, and I believe he was an Alpha Herogen in a Voyager episode, episode Prey, yes. I was surprised to find out, I didn't know this, that he had auditioned 6 times for TNG before being cast as Kern, and he was apparently one of the actors who was considered for the role of Benjamin Sisko when DS9 was being developed. I have to wonder how, the show would have been different for sure, but I wonder how it would be different.
Yeah, hard to say. I mean, I know obviously Avery Brooks just brings a ton to the role,
Yes.
and Tony Todd's certainly an accomplished actor in his own right. But it's always fun to play those what if games, right? To wonder, how would he have made it work over 7 seasons of long nights and long days of work? And
yeah, right, yeah. I was on a previous episode. I was talking with a guest about the actor Kevin Peter Hall, who plays he plays an alien in the episode The Price, TNG. He's a very tall man, about 7 feet tall, and apparently he was in the running at some point for both Geordie LaForge and the character of Data before the actors that they picked were decided on. And I was just thinking, like first of all, like Geordie LaForge, 7 foot tall guy trying to climb through those Jeffrey tubes, that would have been rough. And then also, like, if you pick, he's a great actor, but if you pick like a large guy, you are setting your android character apart. You're making him more alien, So I wonder if they would be going with more of maybe a Frankenstein type thing, because of course Frankenstein in the novel is described as being of gigantic proportion.
Right.
But I think they made the right choice to make him very human, as Brett Spiner is. I also learned that when researching for this, that Tony Todd's aunt, who had raised him as a child, had died just 3 months before they started shooting this episode. So he talked about how it, absent family members were on his mind, and it was very affecting for him.
Interesting. I'm confident that played into. I mean, boy, I respect Tony Todd so much as an actor because he had to cry in almost every scene he was in during The Visitor, and I haven't had an opportunity as an amateur actor to do a lot of really dramatic scenes like that. So I just have to imagine he had to really pull deep from personal experience to generate that on cue, on take after take after take over the week and a half or whatever they had to film it. So I'm impressed that he was able to pull that together so frequently. I mean, obviously that's why they get paid to be actors, because that's what they do. That's their job. Yeah. But just so impressive to watch it. Just seemed to be so effortless and so real when he performed it. Yeah,
I'm sure it was on his mind. He also spoke about how it was an inspiration for him as well, that he could kind of almost feel her whispering to him, that he needed to get back to work, and do his job. So. Rachel Robinson appears in this episode as Melanie, the aspiring writer, and if her surname sounds familiar, it should. She's the daughter of Garrick actor Andrew Robinson and his wife Irene. She was also apparently a leading candidate for the role of Ezri Dax in season 7. And she only has a few TV and film credits in the 2000s. I don't think that she is active in acting currently, but she is a singer-songwriter, and her last album came out in 2015. And Galen Gorg appears as Karina. Gorg is an actress and dancer with many TV credits to her name. She had a recurring role as Nancy O'Reilly in the 2nd season of Twin Peaks. She also had guest roles on Xena Warrior Princess, Stargate SG-1, The A-Team, Lost, Parks and Rec, and many more. In Star Trek Extended Media, Karina and Jake would be married in the main timeline, and the character appears in the tie-in novels Rough Beasts of Empire, Raise the Dawn, and The Good That Men Do. So let's get into the meat of the episode. This is a very well-loved episode of DS9 by both fans and the staff of the show. Avery Brooks and Cyril Lofton have both said it's one of their favorite episodes. I think David Livingston, the director, said it was the best piece of material he's ever been able to direct in terms of the script. And in a 1996 issue of TV Guide, it was voted by fans as the best Star Trek show ever, which apparently really shocked TV Guide. They were surprised that, at the time in 1996, the quote-unquote least popular incarnation of Star Trek had produced the most popular show. Little did they know how DS9 would be viewed 25 years later. And TV Guide itself ranked the episode as the 10th best Star Trek episode for their celebration of the franchise's 30th anniversary. So again, and this comes through in that DS9 documentary, just the idea that you never know exactly how something is going to be embraced over time. Part of the documentary, for people who haven't seen it, involves the actors reading these, sort of poison pen letters from fans, I assume from the time, about how this is a violent, Gene wouldn't have wanted this. Nobody, wants a show like this. You're supposed to boldly go. And of course, now it's seen as one of the best and most influential series ever. Mm-hmm. I wonder if, in another 10 years or so, people will say that about Enterprise.
I don't know. That's a good question. So Enterprise, I think, has a little bit of a stigma on it because it was canceled, midway through, right after the 4th season. Yeah. It didn't end on a great note. I think the series finale could have maybe been different.
Yeah.
'Cause it was really more of a next gen episode with the Enterprise guest stars in it, which was unfortunate. But the episode right before the finale was a more effective send off for the series, I think.
I agree. Yeah.
So that's unfortunate. But I was just talking to some of my fellow RPG writers. Enterprise had probably the best setting of all the series, just in terms of a storytelling standpoint, and especially from a gaming standpoint, because you've got this great pre-Federation setting. You've still got ships going out there boldly exploring, but you've got a whole different slate of possibilities in terms of your relationships with the Klingons and the Romulans and all the different aliens that you can bring into it. Transporters are kind of a chancy technology, so you really have to rely on the shuttles to get you from planet to ship, and it's just a very different feel. And for those of us that are big into the space program, the U.S. and International Space Program, that idea of astronauts going out and exploring and really trying to make the best of it without a prime directive really to operate from. You're just trying to make the best of it as best you can and trying not to make too many mistakes or make too many enemies. I think it just brings a really fresh approach to Star Trek, which I do appreciate quite a bit, especially as a storyteller. So I think Enterprise had so much potential, and I just wish it could have gone on for at least another season or two, so that we could have seen the Federation Romulan War and see how that worked out. But we didn't have the opportunity.
That would have been fascinating. I love in Star Trek the balance between convenience and danger that they experience, because it is the final frontier. It is space. We aren't really supposed to be out there, but we're doing it anyway. But at the same time, we like it when our characters can order a chocolate sundae, from the replicators. So you want to have a little of both of those. And I like the emphasis of that in Enterprise. I like Discovery too, but it does seem like after 50 years of the show, we do want to see our characters have amazing technology, and so there are all these things that they can do that's like, shouldn't that be a little tougher to do? This episode was nominated for an Emmy Award for Outstanding Makeup, but the award that year was actually won by Threshold from Voyager, which I think is fair. It was also nominated for a Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Presentation, but lost to the Babylon 5 episode, The Coming of Shadows. There is a lot going on in this episode. And the frame story makes it seem innocuous and sort of low-key, and the emotions in it are definitely contemplative. But as far as the events, we're seeing quite a bit happen on screen with a lot of ramifications that ultimately are reset, but are still big shifts. Sisko, quote-unquote, dies. Bajor allies himself with Cardassia. The Klingons take over the station. Nog becomes a captain. And I guess the Dominion War never happens at all?
Yeah, it was interesting because this comes out right after Way of the Warrior, where the Klingons are getting to be a big presence, and I guess the Dominion War hadn't really started heating up yet. So they were aware of the Dominion, but they didn't really focus on the Dominion in the Visitor. So I guess maybe the Klingons coming to more prominence and Bajor aligning with them, maybe that changed the relationship between the Dominion and the Alpha Quadrant to where it was less of a factor. Maybe Sisko disappearing changed that dynamic to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, clearly he's instrumental in there being a war and us winning it, being the Federation in this case. But yeah, you have to imagine that it just goes on in this long period of détente and would probably be a negative environment, like in Eastern Europe under the Soviet Union, perhaps. But yeah, it is interesting to see how one man can influence so much of destiny.
Right.
And of course, he is a destined figure. This episode is kind of like DS9's version of Inner Light, but it's also sort of their Yesterday's Enterprise too.
Yesterday's Enterprise. Well, I don't know. I definitely agree with the Inner Light because you get to see a whole life lived.
Yeah.
That is ultimately erased, but then you know that there's still an impact because Jake doesn't remember anything that happened, but Sisko does.
Yeah.
And I wish that was a piece of the episode that I wish they had found a way to tie into at some point later in the series, because Sisko lives the next three and a half seasons knowing what Jake did, right? Or what that future Jake did to keep him together. And it would have been nice to have seen some sort of touchdown to that, maybe near the finale where, Sisko knows he's got to go to the fire caves and leave everybody behind. But it was interesting because the Visitor, it kind of felt like Jake had this whole journey through the episode, but who that journey really impacted Sisko more than it impacted anybody else. And I thought that was a great way to kind of do a pull around there right at the very end.
Yeah, it is. It's different because Jake is the one that, like the Inner Light, Jake is the one that grows old, but Sisko is the one that's ultimately changed by what happens.
Right.
No flute though this time. I should say, and I might get in trouble because I've heard Keith DeCandido say that if a person doesn't like The Visitor, they have no soul and he has nothing to say to them. I like The Visitor, but I don't love The Visitor. I do think that it's probably one of the best episodes of DS9. DeCandido also points out a few reasons why the episode shouldn't work at all. Specifically that there's a sort of lame technobabble element that gets it all started. It ends with no consequences, in a reset. And a guest actor is at the center of the show, which is usually a no-no. In fact, as a freelancer, this must have been a hell of a script from Taylor, because you're generally instructed not to write anything with a huge guest part, or guest characters, even if they did get Tony Todd ultimately.
Right. And if I remember right, didn't they have Sirach Lofton audition or not audition, but try out, and they just felt that Tony Todd was a stronger choice
for the adult parts?
Yeah.
I don't know about that, but I'd imagine that they would probably give him a shot. Yeah.
Yeah. Although, if I remember right, Tony Todd did spend a lot of time studying Sirach Lofton's performances and tried to bring some of his mannerisms into
and he nails it too. Yeah.
Yeah, he did a great job with it.
Yeah. So those are the little things that kind of just bother me about the episode. I mean, it's not enough to I still enjoy it, but I wish that it could have been more integrated with the main cast.
Yeah. Again, because I just recently rewatched it.
Yeah.
Being 20 years later and society has changed a little bit and the internet's changed a little bit. It's funny that you just take some things for granted in the Star Trek universe, where this this aspiring young writer girl kind of wanders through the bayou in the middle of the night in a rainstorm, shows up at this guy's house, and he invites her in, and it's yeah, it's no big deal. It's okay. Nothing freaky is gonna happen. Nothing weird's gonna happen to these people. It's
yeah.
This total Jake Sisko stan comes into the house and is I've been following your work for your whole career, your whole two books, and now I found your house, and now I'm coming in, and
yeah, right.
Yeah, for the more cynical world that we live in now, you might look at that kind of side eye and go, oh, okay, what's going to happen here? This isn't a touching story. This could be this could turn into a horror show in rapid succession, depending on how you write it.
And it's set in the haunted mansion, so
yeah, and it's in a haunted mansion.
Yeah, I don't.
What's going to happen here?
It's an interesting element. I don't think that they intended to play anything with it at all, but yeah. When Picard dies, quote unquote, in Tapestry, Q is there to meet him in the afterlife, and by the time of his death, when at the end of the episode he's stabbed, the changes are reset. The way Picard views those events that happened to him are recontextualized, in a new way. And I wish that something I don't want them to do Tapestry again, but something like that could be more a part of this episode. Like you mentioned that, we see how that affects Sisko's behavior going forward.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little standalone for me.
Star Trek has done a good job with some standalones that have a lasting impact, but I agree with you that I wish, and with Keith, I guess, DeCandido, that it would have been nice to have seen some more ripple effects from it going into the series itself, as opposed to just being a really nice standalone. And I think that's what sets it apart from oh shoot, you know what, I just blanked on it, the later season DS9 episode where they address the racial inequality with Sisko going back in time as a writer.
Far Beyond the Stars.
Far Beyond the Stars, right, where that actually has some ripples in the series, because they keep referencing the Benny Russell character a couple times, especially in the 7th season, and so it's not just a good standalone landmark episode. It actually has ties to the rest of the series. I wish they could have found a way to do that with Visitor a little bit more. I don't know where you would have done it other than to have the Jake and Ben Sisko dynamic work a little differently, with Ben knowing what Jake did and is capable of doing if something like that were to happen again.
Yeah. And that's the core of the episode, really. Yeah. I'm here to praise and not bury it, of course. Mm-hmm. It really is an impressive hour of the show. I love particularly that the centerpiece of the show is the love between a parent and a child. It's not a romantic connection, which we've seen before. And it works specifically because of how much DS9 is committed to the life of these characters, Sisko and Jake and their bond. You could theoretically do an episode like this about Dr. Crusher and Wesley, but it wouldn't have the same resonance. Or you could do it about, I don't know, Janeway and her dog or something, but it wouldn't be the same.
Yeah, and I know that Avery Brooks has mentioned a number of times in a lot of interviews over the years that it was really important to him to portray a positive father-son relationship, especially with a brown relation, brown man, brown woman, because I guess the cultural stigma is that a lot of brown men or black men don't always hang around to watch their kids grow up for whatever many number of reasons, and to see a positive version of that on television was really important to him.
Yeah,
and I think it's clear, and especially in this episode, you get to see that dynamic that you don't see a lot on television.
I've heard Avery Brooks speak before about the fact that a lot of in the mid '90s, DS9 was basically, in a lot of ways, a show about a black family. And there are many scenes where there are only black actors on the screen. And looking at any other sci-fi show, you're not seeing that at that time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I don't think I've ever really delved into the character of Jake on this show before. What do you think about Jake as a character?
I like Jake partly because Jake, I like him there because it really does give us a chance to explore that family dynamic that we don't see a lot on TV. I think they tried to do it with the Crushers on Next Gen.
Yeah.
But I think they had a different set of writers on DS9 who probably did a superior job of focusing on that relationship. I mean, even in like the first couple of seasons, they would have just a couple of not throwaway scenes, but just like quick scenes where you got Sisko dealing with something, but he stops off at their quarters, and Jake is there, and they have a nice little father-son relationship, a little moment there, and just a couple nice beats, and then they go on with the rest of the plot. But you still got those beats in there that reminded you that not only is he the commander of the station, but he's also a father, and he's managing this whole relationship with his son at the same time.
Yeah.
And so for Jake to be there in that role, I thought was great. I thought it was great that he was best friends with Nog for the whole course of the series, and that we got to see Nog. I think Nog became a really key character in the series, and a lot of that is because of his relationship with Jake.
Yeah. Right.
I just don't think you would have focused on Nog as much if he didn't have Jake there to be played off against.
Yeah.
So I think Nog, obviously between the two, Jake and Nog, I think Nog had the stronger character arc from beginning to end of the series, but I think Jake had plenty to do. And I think he got lost a little bit in the 7th season. I wish there had been more for him to do, but at that point they were juggling so many characters and so many storylines that it was probably hard to focus on everybody fairly. But I think he had a good run, and again, I would have liked to have seen more, but I enjoyed it. And as a writer, I enjoyed it, and I think one of the smart things the writers did for the show is that they didn't put Jake in Starfleet, because I think that would have been a little bit too much like the Wesley Crusher story.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like maybe they knew that they'd done that already in Next Gen, and they wanted to go a different route.
Yeah.
So playing with the idea of, maybe his son doesn't decide to join Starfleet and chooses something else. How does that impact Sisko? And then, of course, we had that episode where Sisko's like, oh, you're not going to join Starfleet? Oh, I'm surprised. But at the same time, he's surprised and maybe a little disappointed, but he's also, willing to support his son in whatever he chooses to do. And that's a meaningful, parenting moment there, is that you want what's best for your children, and maybe the path that you think is going to be right for them is something they don't pick, and that's okay, right? You just you work with it.
Yeah, I think there's a whole spin-off series with him as Jake Sisko, Dominion War reporter.
That would be an awesome miniseries if they were ever to do something like that.
I've really warmed to Jake over the years, and I've really come to appreciate the work of Cyril Lofton, who grew as an actor by leaps and bounds as the show went on, and puts in a fantastic performance in this episode. It's a fairly common trope, not just in sci-fi, where a character wants to be a writer or a creator, and we see them struggle with the process. And they're often, Bildungsroman Roman stories. The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man comes to mind, although that's probably one of the greatest examples in the genre. As a writer, what's your general impression of stories about writing? Do they get the writing parts right?
The ones that I can think of, sure. I mean, there's always that conceit, though, right? Because like every movie and every TV show about a writer is written by a writer, so it's kind of like we're preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
But like, even Throw Mama from the Train, the classic with Crystal and Danny DeVito,
Yeah.
that is all about writing. And like, there's so much truth in there. If you're a writer, you can identify with both characters completely.
Yeah.
And obviously a writer wrote it. And, all of this, internal angst that we carry with us as writers just finds its way onto the page and then out into the screen. And then, I'm sure the actors, they have their own set of angsts that they carry with them, and I'm sure they find ways to identify with it because it's all shared misery to some extent.
Yeah, the misery and the angst are good. Yeah, those are true focuses. I feel like those stories, or some of them, emphasize inspiration far too heavily. I saw this thing, or I kissed this girl, and now the words are flowing out of me. Get me a pen. Come on, if you haven't banged your head against a desk for an hour straight, you're not a writer. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, they mentioned that in The Visitor, where the Melanie's the writer character, right? Yeah, Melanie says, I'm just waiting for inspiration. I'm waiting to figure out what I'm going to write. And I wish Jake had said, just sit your butt down at the chair and start writing.
Right.
Just put your hands on the keyboard or put your finger on the pen and just start writing, because it might be junk, but at least you're writing, and that's the only way you're going to learn to be a writer is to actually, write. You're never going to learn how to write if you just read and you don't ever actually try to put words down on the page. And I agree with you. I wish more writing themed episodes and movies would just, tell people that, it's not enough to just think about it. The divine muse is not going to strike a lightning bolt
right
down your head and get you to suddenly be a writer. You've actually got to put the work in.
Yeah.
A lot of writers don't like to hear that, don't like to hear it because they don't want to believe that writing is like any other skill, right? You have to practice and practice and practice and do it.
Yeah.
You can't just be a concert violinist, overnight. You've got to put the work in.
Right. I'm not feeling it. Just put it down. Yeah. Yeah. Those stories can hurt the aspirations of baby writers. Somebody who doesn't want to write, or somebody who wants to write but doesn't feel like their muse is always there, or whatever, they'll just pack it in because they think there's something wrong with them. But yeah, just stick with it.
Yeah. The best piece of advice I got was from a writer I admire for years and years and years. It's Dean Wesley Smith. And he said, writing is the best job in the world. Because we sit down in a room and we make stuff up and people, read it and buy it. And there's no better job because you're just sitting here making up stories. You're lying to people and they're buying it. And he said, if you think that's hard work, go dig ditches for a living or go work in an emergency room for a living. That's hard work. We're telling stories and we're, maybe changing lives, but, no one's going to die if we don't write a story or we don't get this next couple of pages written out or whatever. It's all on us to get the story out. And if we're driven enough to do it, we'll do it. And it's just fascinating to me when I read, blogs and discussion forums and stuff of writers who are just so full of the angst and the fear of like, what if I write something and no one likes it? And, how do I get started, or when's the muse going to tell me what to do, and where can I find time to write, and all this stuff. And it's just amazing that it's the same conversations over and over and over again.
Yeah.
They just don't go away.
I love those words by Dean Wesley Smith. I could use some more regular hours though. A little 9 to 5 wouldn't hurt. I hate getting up in the middle of the night to have to write something.
Yeah, you gotta jot it down when it strikes.
Right?
Yeah.
I
For a long time, I would have a little digital voice recorder on the bedside table with me, so that if I did have a dream or something and something inspiration struck me, I could note it down and then go back to sleep. But at least I knew it. I hadn't lost it.
Yeah. Well, let's put our little spoiler warning in here because I wanted to talk about the final scene of the episode. So if you haven't seen it, and I hope you have, we're going to spoil the final scene. The ending, whatever minor issues I have with the episode, the ending nails it and really gets me every time. Like even this time I thought, I'm watching this analytically. I'm just going to write things down. And they get to that last scene between Sisko and old Jake, and I'm like, okay, all right.
Yeah, I just watched I just watched it to get ready for this discussion, and the tears were flowing. I think it's just the music aside, because of course the music is always there to manipulate you into feeling something, and it was well done, of course. But just the acting between Tony Todd, and especially in that closing scene, the acting from Avery Brooks was just so amazing because he's realizing that his son has devoted his entire life to bringing him back and has given up on everything else, including his wife and the chance of grandchildren and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And just to understand the depth of the love and the desperation that Jake had for him, I mean, it's just really powerful. And again, like as a fairly new dad, it's like I have to think about that because like I see the adoration that my son has in his eyes every time he sees me and my wife, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's so much responsibility knowing that, right?
Yeah.
And I think Avery Brooks obviously just drilled that performance home right at the very end there, just realizing how much that he means to his son just really colors his relationship there.
Yeah. I've always wondered, how old do Trek people get? I think Jake is near to 100 when he passes away. He takes his own life, but it did seem like he was not doing well and possibly had a terminal illness. But in the future of this, this 24th century, how old can people live to?
Well, I think Admiral McCoy in Encounter 4 was like 140, 139, somewhere
up there,
somewhere up there. So they're clearly living well into their early, 120s or so. I mean, obviously Vulcans live longer and other species live different lifespans. Yeah. But I mean, you figure 200 years from now, they've got good, superior eating habits than what we have, and different exercise, different attentions to different focuses on life. Because like when you're not quite so concerned about where your next paycheck's coming from, you can focus on different things, obviously. So
a lot of yoga.
Clearly, we see a lot of examples in Star Trek where the lifespan is quite advanced from where we are now.
Yeah, and of course, I'm sure you could eat if they've got synthahol, they must have synth cheeseburgers in the future too. So.
Well, Troy had no problem eating chocolate whenever she felt like it, and it seemed to have no ill effect on her. Yeah. So
there was the one time that she ordered a chocolate sundae, and the replicator's like, "Aren't you on a diet?" It's like, this is that's too high for your caloric intake. The setting. Something else I've always wondered. It's come up on this show a time or two. Is what is the Federation's opinion on suicide as a social anarchy of sorts? I'm guessing they're strongly committed to personal autonomy, but if you decided that you had enough or you had a terminal illness, where would they come down on that?
That's an interesting question. I know that obviously the intent of the episode is that Jake is taking his own life to cut the cord, as it were, so that Sisko can bounce back into his timeline and live. Obviously, Ben had a problem with it because obviously it's his son and he doesn't want his son to die, much less die to enable him to live. Yeah. But as a society, I would imagine the Federation would bend over backwards to do everything they could to give people the psychological and emotional support that they needed in order to thrive and survive. Sure. So I'm not sure that I'd have to think about it. I'd have to do some digging to remember if the episode's really focused on suicide.
I'm trying to remember if I've ever seen a Starfleet doctor assist a suicide or euthanize someone.
Actually, McCoy did in Star Trek 5. He mentioned that his father was dying from a terminal illness and asked McCoy to help him end his life.
That's right.
And McCoy initially didn't want to do it, refused to do it, and then finally decided to do it. And then the kicker was 2 weeks later they discovered a cure for his father's disease. Yeah. So he had that guilt. So there is an obvious example from canon. Yeah. Where they do it.
And it's funny because that doesn't really answer my question because, I mean, clearly he should not have been his father's doctor. That's like a conflict of interest.
Yeah,
but
for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's such a cruel construction by the writer of this episode too, because of the function of this tether, he has to commit to this, act of suicide. Mm-hmm. And he was probably really close to natural death anyway. So it's his choice to let go. But, old Jake, who's a totally different character than young Jake at this point, is gone forever.
Yeah, but having rewatched the episode, I wasn't entirely convinced that Jake was actually suffering from a terminal illness. I got the impression that he was intentionally, wearing himself down and taking those injections to get him
a series of. Okay.
That's the impression I got. I mean, maybe he took that injection right before Melanie showed up, and then he was on the path to dying. But sure. I just got the impression that he was setting himself up to do that, so that he would be ready to.
Interesting. I just got the idea that it was, like a hypospray full of curare or something like that. But you're saying it was sort of like a quick sundowning, like a series of injections. I can see that.
Yeah, that's the impression I got. But more now that I think about it, because he had mentioned that he was working on that collection of stories and he was going to write 2 more, but now there's no more time. So maybe, yeah, I don't know. I'd have to go back and watch it again and really dig into it to remember. But I mean, obviously the bottom line is that he did decide to off himself so that his father could live. Yeah. And I mean, sure. I mean, obviously Jake had no problem with it. Ben Sisko had some problems with it, but society as a whole, that's a good question. They probably look at it and see, well, that's sad and we're sympathetic, and what could we have done differently? And I don't know what else you would do with that.
I don't know either. We're going to need some I need David Mack to write a book about it has a character that commits assisted suicide. Well, that's not happy stuff to talk about. As we get to the end here, is there anything about the episode you wanted to say that we haven't covered yet?
Again, 20 years later, the opening of it, I mean, honestly, is a little contrived because you got the writer in there, and then like some of the lines, some of the dialogue is really right on the nose, where they're kind of like, here's the problem, here's the solution, here's the question, here's the answer to carry the plot forward, and obviously you've got to do that to get the information out to the audience. Yeah. But really, if you just let that go and just let Melanie be kind of the guide through the episode, and just appreciate the acting and the story and just the emotions that it brings up, and the relationship between a parent and a child, is just really, really well done, and not something you'd probably expect from DS9, because like I know I spend a lot of time on discussion forums, especially currently for the game, where I'm trying to keep a thumb on the pulse of the gaming community and what they're looking for the game. Yeah. But a lot of times the DS9 fans, more recently DS9 fans, are really more focused on the Dominion War and how interesting that war is, because we don't see a war that much in Star Trek, and think, okay, DS9's all dark and it's all about the war and it's all about the shooting and the killing the Klingons and the Dominion and all the fighting aspects to it. And The Visitor is a great example of how DS9 can do more than just a war storyline. Yeah. And that's why I really try to recommend it as an episode to watch for DS9, because it does present a great character piece and a character drama that has nothing to do really with spaceships, nothing to do with a war, nothing to do with fighting or Klingons or Romulans or whatever. It's just it's a great introspective character piece about a father and a son, and the extent one is willing to go to help, or to save the other one's life. Yeah. So great character piece. And I mean, again, like you were saying, the direction's top notch, the acting, the writing, I mean, it just all came together into one great episode.
Absolutely. So no Jake Sisko War Correspondent supplement coming out soon?
Not specifically, no. The Gamma Quadrant source book we have coming up in a couple of months obviously covers the war from beginning to end. Sure. And covers a lot about the Dominion, but it doesn't specifically talk about Jake, other than the fact that he's a war correspondent. I think we have a couple of references in there to it, but obviously a standalone product entirely focused on Jake, not realistic.
I want to roll up a war correspondent character now.
There you go.
Let's talk My Space Dad Can Beat Up Your Space Dad. Who's your favorite captain and why?
I'm gonna be a homer and a stan and stick with the DS9, and Ben Sisko's the top captain for me. Sure. And I think because there are so many angles to him that are interesting that you don't see from like Kirk or Sisko, or I'm sorry, Kirk and Picard and Janeway and Archer. Just the fact that he's a widower, and he's a father, and he's a Starfleet commander, and then a Starfleet captain, and then he's also got the weight of being the emissary of the Bajorans on top of that. Yeah. Like, and how do you? There's been plenty of episodes where he has to balance, am I a Starfleet officer or am I the religious emissary to the Bajoran people? How do I balance that out? And then at one point Admiral Ross says, okay, well, it's time for you to pick one or the other. So what's it going to be? And just there's so many facets to his character that they get to explore over the course of the series. And so much of the war is entirely on his shoulders, right? So yeah. I think Sisko is the captain for me for sure.
All right.
How about you?
Oh boy! Every once in a while, Kesk ask me that, and it changes often. I usually say Kirk. just because, as many people have said, it's like, you never forget your first captain. Like that's sort of where I entered in. But more and more, I've been thinking about of Janeway, and how I think that in a lot of ways she's sort of like a female version of Kirk, in that she is intrepid in the way that he is. She doesn't have a lot of time for bureaucrats or bullies like he does. And also, I just appreciate, what she did in the action of the story, which was not give up and bring this crew of hers home and go through all the adversity and hardships. And she's kind of wry, and I like that. And I love coffee, too.
Yeah.
Now that we've reached the end of the show, you'll receive a commission and the rank of ensign. What department on the ship do you work in?
I've got to stick with a long time running joke in my Star Trek group's campaign,
Okay.
And I would be an ensign in turbolift control.
Ah, okay, all right.
It's a throwaway reference from one TNG episode where there's some sort of disaster on the ship, and Picard calls down to turbolift control to figure out what's going on.
Right.
And that was a long discussion in our group. Like, what does this guy what does this person in turbolift control do? Are they just watching the different turbolifts go from point A to point B? Are they are they responsible for directing the traffic? Like, are they like a subway manager where they're directing the traffic of the different trains?
Right.
What does that job entail? So, so obviously that would be part of the operations division. So probably like a low level engineer of some type.
Okay. And of course, the job has its ups and downs.
And sideways.
All right. Yeah, and you're sideways, yes. Well, Ensign Johnson, thanks for joining me to talk about Star Trek and the Star Trek universe. If people want to continue the conversation, and they can at EISTpod on Twitter and the Enterprising Individuals Facebook page, where can people find you online?
I am on Twitter, scribenetti.com. You can find me if you're into the role-playing game at all. I'm all over the place on Reddit, Modiphius.com's forums, Facebook, elsewhere. I'm also on some writing channels, so not hard to find.
Yeah, and absolutely, listeners, if you're interested in role-playing games and Star Trek, you should check out the Modiphius game. It really is great.
Thank you. And Aaron, thank you so much for having me on board. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks again for joining me. And we're signing off until the next mission. Hailing frequencies closed.
It's on your mind.